You're walking down a hallway you've walked 1,000 times before. The carpet, the walls, the way light falls through the window at the far end. Everything is exactly as it should be. And yet something feels imperceptibly wrong. Not threatening, not dramatic, just slightly removed, as if you're watching yourself move through space from a position half an inch behind your own eyes. The feeling passes in seconds, maybe minutes, but it leaves behind a faint cognitive residue, an awareness that the reliability of perception is not quite the fixed constant you'd assumed it was. This experience has a name in clinical literature: derealization. The term appears in the DSM-5, defined with characteristic medical precision as experiences of unreality or detachment with respect to surroundings, where individuals or objects are experienced as unreal, dreamlike, foggy, lifeless, or visually distorted. But the clinical description doesn't quite capture the phenomenological strangeness of the experience itself. People who encounter it often struggle to articulate exactly what has changed. The world looks the same. Sounds arrive normally. Objects maintain their positions. Yet something fundamental about the quality of experience has shifted. It's as if a transparent barrier has materialized between consciousness and the world it inhabits. A sensory fog that doesn't obscure detail, but somehow drains it of substance. What makes this particularly unsettling is not the distortion itself, but the recognition that your baseline sense of reality, the feeling that you're directly encountering the world as it actually is, may be more fragile than you realized. The experience challenges an assumption so basic, we rarely notice we're making it. That perception is a straightforward window onto external reality, and that consciousness occupies a stable, continuous relationship with the environment it observes. The neurological mechanisms underlying this feeling are beginning to come into focus, though the picture remains incomplete. Peer-reviewed studies using functional brain imaging suggest that during episodes of derealization, certain regions that normally integrate emotional response with sensory perception begin to disconnect. Specifically, the corticolimbic system, including the amygdala, appears to reduce its usual communication with areas of the prefrontal cortex responsible for integrating emotion with cognition. What this suggests is that derealization may involve a functional separation between the systems that register sensory information and the systems that give that information emotional significance. Under normal circumstances, perception is not emotionally neutral. When you see a familiar face, a cascade of emotional associations accompanies the visual recognition almost instantaneously. The face doesn't just look like your friend, it feels like your friend, carrying with it a rich affective context that makes the perception meaningful. This emotional coloring is so automatic, so deeply woven into the texture of ordinary experience that its presence goes unnoticed. Only when it fails does its absence become apparent. During derealization, this emotional component appears to be stripped away or significantly dampened. Visual recognition remains intact. You can identify objects, navigate space, respond appropriately to your environment. But the emotional resonance that normally accompanies perception is reduced or absent. The result is a strange cognitive dissonance. You know intellectually that you're looking at something familiar, but you don't feel its familiarity. The disconnect between intellectual recognition and emotional response creates the sensation that something about reality itself has changed, when what has actually changed is the way your brain is constructing your experience of reality. This brings us to a more fundamental question about perception itself. The intuitive model most of us carry is that sensory experience works like a camera. Light enters the eye, sound enters the ear, and these signals are transmitted more or less directly to consciousness, providing an accurate representation of the external world. But this model is incorrect in a profound way. Perception is not passive reception, it's active construction. At any given moment, your brain is receiving hundreds of disparate sensory inputs: photons hitting retinal cells, air pressure waves vibrating the cochlea, pressure sensors in your skin reporting contact and temperature, proprioceptors tracking the position of your limbs in space. These inputs don't arrive pre-organized into a coherent experience. Your brain must integrate them, interpret them, and construct from them a unified model of what is happening around you and within you. This construction happens so quickly and automatically that it feels instantaneous, but it's not. There's a processing delay, brief but measurable, between sensory input and conscious awareness. What you experience as now, as the immediate present moment, is actually a very recent memory. Your brain is presenting you with a constructed narrative of what just happened, assembled from sensory data, filtered through prediction mechanisms, and coloured by emotional systems. The smoothness of this construction, the way it presents itself as direct and unmediated, is itself an achievement of neural processing. When that processing experiences even minor disruptions, when the various streams of information don't integrate quite as seamlessly as usual, the constructed nature of perception can become briefly apparent. This helps explain why derealization often occurs during periods of intense anxiety. Anxiety is fundamentally a state of heightened threat detection and arousal. When the brain's threat monitoring systems are activated strongly enough, they can begin to override or suppress other processing. During panic attacks, for instance, the overwhelming activation of the sympathetic nervous system can temporarily disrupt the normal integration of sensory and emotional processing. The mind, in an attempt to protect itself from overwhelming input, begins to tune out aspects of experience. But consciousness doesn't simply shut down. It continues processing, continues constructing a model of reality, but now with reduced emotional integration. The world becomes a place that feels unreal, not because anything external has changed, but because the internal systems that give reality its felt quality of realness have been temporarily dampened. What remains difficult here is determining precisely where the boundary lies between normal perceptual variation and clinical dissociation. Everyone experiences moments of mild disconnection, times when attention drifts, when familiar surroundings feel momentarily strange, when consciousness seems to observe itself from a slight distance. These minor fluctuations in the quality of awareness are likely a normal feature of how perception works, small variations in the efficiency of neural integration that usually pass unnoticed. Derealization represents an extreme point on this spectrum, where the disruption becomes pronounced enough to be consciously noticed and experienced as disturbing. The relationship between anxiety and derealization appears to be bidirectional and self-reinforcing. Anxiety can trigger episodes of derealization by disrupting normal emotional processing, but the experience of derealization itself then becomes a source of anxiety, the unsettling recognition that your perception of reality can become unreliable, that the stability of conscious experience cannot be taken for granted, creates a new layer of threat. This secondary anxiety can worsen the derealization, creating a feedback loop where each experience of unreality increases vigilance and worry, which in turn makes future episodes more likely. This cycle reveals something important about the relationship between emotion and perception. They're not separate systems that occasionally interact. They're deeply intertwined aspects of a single process. Your emotional state shapes what you perceive, and what you perceive shapes your emotional state. The feeling that reality is real, that you are genuinely in contact with an external world, depends on this integration functioning smoothly. When it doesn't, when emotion and perception begin to operate independently, the subjective quality of reality itself can change. There's another factor that can disrupt the constructed stability of perception: trauma. Studies examining derealization in populations with post-traumatic stress disorder have found rates significantly higher than in the general population. Approximately 30% of individuals with PTSD report recurring experiences of derealization, compared to around 2% in the broader population. This correlation is especially pronounced in people who experience trauma during childhood. The mechanism appears to be protective in origin. When faced with overwhelming threat from which physical escape is impossible, consciousness can initiate a kind of psychological escape instead. Dissociation, the broader category that includes derealization, provides a way to create distance from unbearable experience. The mind learns to separate itself from immediate perception, to observe rather than fully inhabit the moment. This can be adaptive in the short term, allowing someone to endure what would otherwise be psychologically intolerable. But like many protective mechanisms, dissociation can persist long after the original threat has passed. The brain, having learned this pattern of response, may continue to engage it automatically when feeling threatened or overwhelmed, even in situations that are objectively safe. The result is recurring experiences of unreality triggered not by present danger, but by learned associations, by situations that echo past trauma in ways that may not be consciously recognized. What this suggests is that derealization is not simply a perceptual glitch or a random malfunction. It's often a meaningful response, even if that response has outlived its usefulness. Understanding why reality feels unreal requires understanding what function that feeling might serve, what psychological need it might address, however imperfectly. This protective withdrawal can become its own problem. When dissociation begins as an emergency response to unbearable circumstances, it serves a clear function. But the brain doesn't always distinguish cleanly between genuine threat and situations that merely resemble past danger. The pattern, once established, can activate in response to subtle cues that bear only superficial similarity to the original trauma. A certain quality of light, a tone of voice, the physical sensation of being trapped in a crowded space. These triggers don't need to be consciously recognized to initiate the dissociative response. The process can unfold automatically, outside awareness, leaving someone feeling suddenly disconnected without understanding why. This automation reveals something about how the brain organizes memory and response. Traumatic memory doesn't always encode in the same way as ordinary autobiographical memory. It can fragment, storing sensory details, emotional states, and bodily responses in disconnected pieces that don't integrate into a coherent narrative. When these fragments are triggered, they can produce the physiological and perceptual changes associated with the original event without producing clear conscious memory of what's being responded to. The result is derealization that feels unprovoked, disconnection without obvious cause, a shift in the quality of perception that seems to come from nowhere. But trauma isn't the only pathway to feeling that reality has become unreal. There's another common trigger, one that might seem paradoxical: complete safety and routine. Extended periods of low stimulation, predictable environments, and minimal novelty can also produce a subtle drift toward derealization. When your brain encounters the same patterns day after day, when perception becomes automated because nothing requires close attention, conscious experience can begin to feel thin or distant. This isn't the dramatic dissociation of trauma. It's something quieter, a gradual fading of vividness, a sense that you're moving through familiar spaces without quite inhabiting them. The mechanism appears to involve attentional resources. Your brain constantly makes decisions about what deserves conscious processing and what can be handled automatically. Familiar environments and routine activities demand minimal attention. They've been mapped thoroughly, predicted accurately, reduced to efficient patterns that require little conscious engagement. This efficiency is generally useful. It allows you to navigate your home without conscious thought, to perform practice tasks while thinking about something else entirely. But when too much of experience becomes automatic, when novelty drops below some threshold, conscious awareness can begin to feel like it's operating at a distance from perception itself. This explains a strange feature of derealization. It can occur both during extreme stress and during extreme monotony. The two situations produce the disconnection through different routes, but they share a common element. Both involve contexts where full conscious engagement with immediate sensory experience becomes disadvantageous or unnecessary. Under threat, consciousness withdraws to protect itself. During routine, consciousness disengages because engagement isn't required. In both cases, the normal integration between perception and awareness loosens. The world continues to register through your senses, information continues to be processed, but the subjective quality of that processing changes. It becomes less immediate, less vivid, less emotionally coloured. There's evidence for this in how people describe the subjective experience. During trauma-related derealization, the world often feels distant but heightened in certain ways. Colours might seem oversaturated or sounds unnaturally sharp, even as emotional response flattens and everything feels separated by invisible barriers. During routine-related derealization, the descriptions tend toward fading and dulling. Colours lose richness, sounds become muffled, everything feels slightly washed out, like perception is operating through a filter that removes some essential quality of presence. These differences suggest that different neural mechanisms are producing superficially similar subjective states. The emotional component appears particularly important. Research examining derealization has identified something called visual hypoemotionality. It's exactly what it sounds like, a reduction in emotional response to viewed objects. When you look at something, your brain doesn't just process visual information, it also generates emotional colouring based on past associations, current relevance, and contextual meaning. A photograph of someone you love produces not just visual recognition, but affective response. The face appears familiar, and the familiarity feels warm. You see the person, and you feel something about seeing them. In derealization, this emotional colouring can diminish or disappear entirely. You recognise the face. You know intellectually who it is. But the expected feeling doesn't arrive. The visual recognition occurs without the emotional resonance that normally accompanies it. This creates a particularly disturbing form of disconnection. You're looking at your own home, or your partner's face, or your hands moving in front of you, and intellectually you know what you're seeing. But nothing feels the way it should. The emotional signature that normally confirms reality has become unreliable. This generates cognitive dissonance that itself becomes a source of distress. The mismatch between what you know and what you feel creates a sense that something is profoundly wrong, which can then trigger anxiety that worsens the derealization, completing a feedback loop that's difficult to interrupt. Understanding this mechanism helps explain why derealization is so closely linked with anxiety disorders. Studies examining the relationship have found that chronic derealization is significantly more common in people with generalized anxiety disorder, social anxiety disorder, and obsessive-compulsive disorder. The incidence increases as anxiety becomes more persistent. What starts as occasional episodes during periods of acute stress can, in the context of chronic anxiety, become a more constant background state. The heightened arousal and hypervigilance characteristic of anxiety disorders appear to strain the systems responsible for integrating emotion with perception. The brain, trying to manage overwhelming internal states, begins to tune out external sensory input or strip it of emotional content to reduce the total load on processing systems. This creates a difficult situation. Derealization is disturbing partly because it feels like evidence of something seriously wrong. The experience is strange enough, unsettling enough, that it's natural to worry it indicates a severe problem, maybe a neurological disorder, or a break with reality itself. But that worry increases anxiety, which worsens the derealization, which provides more evidence that something is wrong, which increases anxiety further. The cycle becomes self-sustaining. Each episode of unreality generates fear of future episodes, which creates hypervigilance toward internal sensations and perceptual quality, which makes subtle shifts in awareness more noticeable, which triggers more episodes. Breaking this cycle requires something counterintuitive, accepting that derealization, despite how disturbing it feels, is not dangerous. It's not a sign of impending psychosis or permanent damage to perception. It's a temporary shift in how the brain is processing experience, usually triggered by identifiable factors like stress, anxiety, or fatigue. The shift feels profound because it affects the subjective quality of consciousness itself. But it doesn't indicate that reality has changed or that perception has become permanently unreliable. Recognizing this intellectually doesn't immediately resolve the experience, but it can reduce the secondary anxiety that worsens and prolongs episodes. There's another factor that influences susceptibility to derealization: sleep. Disruptions to normal sleep patterns, particularly sleep deprivation, significantly increase the likelihood of dissociative experiences. The relationship makes sense when you consider what happens during dreaming. In dreams, the prefrontal cortex, responsible for reality testing and logical reasoning, shows reduced activity. Meanwhile, emotional centers like the amygdala and hippocampus remain highly active, generating vivid sensory and emotional content without the usual reality-checking mechanisms. This is why dreams can feel completely real while you're experiencing them, despite containing logically impossible elements. The systems that would normally flag these impossibilities as unreal aren't fully engaged. Upon waking, the prefrontal cortex reactivates, reinstating the ability to distinguish between imagination and reality, between memory and present perception. But what happens when sleep is disrupted or insufficient? The boundary between dreaming and waking consciousness can become less distinct. The reality testing mechanisms that should fully engage upon waking may remain partially suppressed. This creates conditions where the sense of what's real becomes less stable, where perception takes on some of the qualities associated with dreaming, even during waking hours. The world might feel slightly unreal or distant. Familiar objects might seem strange. The usual confidence that you're fully awake and properly perceiving reality can weaken. This suggests that derealization isn't always a response to specific triggers. Sometimes it reflects a more fundamental instability in the systems that construct and maintain conscious awareness. Sleep deprivation, chronic stress, and sustained anxiety all affect the brain's ability to maintain the integration necessary for stable, vivid, emotionally coherent perception. When these systems are strained, the constructed nature of perception becomes more apparent. The seamlessness that usually characterizes conscious experience begins to show seams. You become aware, perhaps for the first time, that your sense of reality is not direct contact with an external world, but a constructed model that requires ongoing maintenance. This awareness itself can be unsettling. Once you've experienced reality feeling unreal, it's difficult to fully return to the naive assumption that perception is simply a transparent window. You've discovered that the window can fog, that the glass can distort, that your brain is actively constructing everything you experience. This knowledge doesn't necessarily produce derealization, but it changes the relationship you have with your own consciousness. There's a new fragility to it, a recognition that the stability you took for granted is actually a kind of ongoing achievement, something that can be disrupted. What makes this particularly difficult is that derealization affects the very mechanisms you'd normally use to evaluate whether your perception is accurate. You can't step outside perception to check whether it's working properly. All you have access to is the current quality of experience itself. And when that quality shifts, when things stop feeling real, you're left without reliable tools to assess what's happening. Intellectually, you might know that derealization is a recognized phenomenon, that it doesn't indicate psychosis or permanent damage. But that intellectual knowledge exists within the same perceptual system that's producing the feeling of unreality. The knowledge itself can feel distant or abstract, less convincing than it should be, because the emotional and experiential weight that would normally accompany understanding has been diminished by the same processes that are causing the derealization. This is why communication about the experience is so challenging. When someone tries to describe derealization to others who haven't experienced it, they often struggle to find adequate words. The metaphors they reach for, looking through glass, feeling wrapped in cotton, watching life on a screen, are attempts to convey a change in subjective quality that doesn't correspond to any obvious change in sensory input. To someone who hasn't felt it, these descriptions might sound vague or exaggerated, but to someone experiencing it, the change is unmistakable, even while being nearly impossible to articulate. It's a shift in something so fundamental to consciousness that we don't normally have language for it. We have words for seeing clearly or feeling anxious, but we don't have simple terms for the baseline sense that perception is real and immediate. So we notice its absence only when it occurs. The difficulty of describing derealization points to a broader limitation in how we think about consciousness. We tend to focus on content, what we're perceiving, thinking, or feeling, but there are qualities of experience that operate at a different level, aspects of awareness itself rather than what awareness contains. The sense that reality is real is one of these. It's not something you perceive, it's a quality of perception itself. And when that quality shifts, it reveals that consciousness has a structure we rarely notice because it usually operates too smoothly to attract attention. One of the stranger aspects of experiencing derealization is how it changes your relationship to knowledge itself. You can understand intellectually what's happening, that your brain's perceptual systems have shifted into a different processing mode, that the emotional coloring normally applied to sensory input has been dampened, that familiarity signals aren't matching stored templates correctly. But understanding these mechanisms doesn't restore normal perception. The knowledge exists in the same consciousness that feels unreal, which creates an odd doubling. You're simultaneously the observer of the phenomenon and trapped within it. This isn't like understanding why a magic trick works and thereby dispelling the illusion. The trick continues even when you know exactly how it's performed. What makes this particularly disorienting is that it reveals something about how consciousness actually operates. Under normal circumstances, perception feels immediate and transparent. You don't experience yourself constructing a model of reality from sensory fragments. You simply see the room, hear the traffic, feel the chair beneath you. The constructive process is invisible to you, but derealization makes that process partially visible without giving you control over it. You become aware that perception is assembled, that there are mechanisms working to create the feeling of realness, and that those mechanisms can malfunction. Yet you can't reach behind perception to fix what's broken. You're stuck on this side of it. Consider what happens when someone tries to reassure themselves during an episode. They might think, this isn't real, it's just derealization. My perception will return to normal. But this isn't real is a strange thing to think when the unreality itself is the entire problem. What they mean is something like, this feeling of unreality doesn't reflect actual changes in the external world, but the feeling itself is quite real. It's the dominant quality of their current experience. So they're using concepts like real and unreal in confusing ways because the phenomenon has disrupted the normal relationship between those terms. The external world hasn't changed, their perception of it has, but perception is their only access to the external world. So in a sense, for them, in that moment, the world has changed. This points to something philosophically uncomfortable. We normally assume a stable separation between perception and reality, between how things seem and how they are. But that separation requires that perception itself remains relatively stable and reliable. When perception becomes unstable, when the feeling of realness detaches from sensory input, the distinction between appearance and reality becomes harder to maintain. Not because external reality has become uncertain, but because your access to it, the only access you have, has become unreliable. You're left with a strange epistemological situation where you know intellectually that the world is stable, but you can't feel that stability. And feelings, in this context, aren't just emotions. They're part of the structure of conscious experience itself. There's neuroscientific evidence for why this disconnect is so profound. Imaging studies suggest that during derealization, there's increased activity in brain regions associated with attention and cognitive control, areas like the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, while there's decreased activity in regions that normally integrate emotion with perception, particularly parts of the limbic system, including the amygdala. What this pattern suggests is that the brain is working harder to process information while simultaneously dampening the emotional and somatic responses that usually accompany perception. It's as if the cognitive machinery is running at higher intensity but has been disconnected from the affective machinery that makes perception feel meaningful and immediate. This neurological pattern makes sense from a protective standpoint. If someone is overwhelmed by anxiety, trauma, stress, or overstimulation, the brain may essentially turn down the emotional volume to prevent a complete system overload. But emotion isn't just feeling. It's part of how the brain assigns significance and reality to perceptual input. Strip away emotional colouring, and you're left with perception that feels hollow, distant, or dreamlike. The visual information is still being processed. The auditory information is still arriving. But something about how that information is integrated into conscious experience has changed. The result is a kind of perceptual experience that feels less than fully real because it lacks the effective weight that normally grounds perception in felt presence. What's particularly revealing is that this can happen even in the absence of extreme stress. Chronic low-level anxiety, sleep disruption, repetitive cognitive patterns, or even extended periods of monotony can gradually shift the brain into this dampened processing mode. In some cases, people don't notice it happening until it's already severe. They've been moving through their days with slightly flattened affect, slightly diminished presence, slightly less connection to their surroundings, and the change has been gradual enough that they've adapted without realizing something has shifted. Then at some point, perhaps triggered by a moment of metacognitive awareness, they suddenly notice that everything feels off, and the noticing itself can intensify the feeling. This gradual onset explains why derealization often coexists with depression and anxiety. These conditions alter baseline processing in ways that can accumulate over time. Someone with chronic anxiety is in a persistent state of heightened arousal and vigilance, which requires enormous cognitive resources to maintain. The dampening of emotional processing may develop as a compensatory mechanism, a way to continue functioning despite the ongoing strain. But once that dampening is in place, it creates its own problems. The person now feels disconnected from their environment, which can generate new anxiety specifically about the disconnection, which in turn reinforces the very mechanisms producing it. There's something circular and self-reinforcing about how derealization interacts with anxiety. The anxiety triggers protective dissociation. The dissociation feels disturbing and generates more anxiety. That anxiety deepens the dissociation. Breaking this cycle requires somehow interrupting the feedback loop, but that's difficult when the very cognitive systems you'd normally use to regulate emotion and attention are the ones caught in the loop. It's like trying to fix a malfunctioning program using tools provided by the same program. What complicates this further is the role of attention. Derealization often involves a shift in how attention is deployed. Rather than attention flowing naturally towards salient features of the environment, it becomes self-focused and monitoring. The person is watching themselves experience, checking constantly to see if things feel real yet, evaluating the quality of their perception rather than simply perceiving. This metacognitive attention doesn't restore normal perception. It can actually reinforce the sense of separation. Watching yourself perceive creates distance between the observer and the observed, between the self that's monitoring and the experience being monitored. That distance is itself a form of unreality. This helps explain why trying to think your way out of derealization rarely works. Increased cognitive effort, increased self-monitoring, increased attempts to analyze what's happening, all of these tend to maintain or worsen the condition rather than resolve it. The solution, paradoxically, often involves reducing cognitive effort, letting go of the monitoring, allowing perception to occur without constant evaluation. But that's extraordinarily difficult to do when everything feels wrong and your instinct is to figure out what's happening and fix it. The impulse to understand and control is precisely what needs to be suspended, which is a deeply counterintuitive response to distress. There's also a temporal dimension to derealization that makes it particularly destabilizing. Normal conscious experience has a sense of temporal flow, a feeling that you're moving continuously from past through present toward future. Events seem to unfold in a coherent sequence. But derealization can disrupt that sense of temporal continuity. Time might feel slowed down, sped up, or strangely fragmented. There's a sense of being stuck in the present moment, unable to fully connect it to past moments or project forward into future ones. This temporal disruption adds to the dreamlike quality because dreams also often lack normal temporal coherence. You experience a sequence of events but without the usual sense of time passing at a consistent rate. What's happening here involves the same memory and integration processes we discussed earlier. Your sense of temporal flow depends on the brain continuously updating its model of where you are in time, connecting the immediate present to the recent past and anticipated future. When those updating processes are disrupted, when the connections between moments feel loose or discontinuous, temporal experience becomes strange. You might find yourself unable to accurately estimate how much time has passed. A few minutes might feel like hours, or hours might compress into what feels like moments. This temporal disorientation contributes to the sense that you're not fully inhabiting reality, that you're somehow adjacent to normal experience rather than fully within it. Interestingly, there are ways to induce mild forms of derealization in people who don't normally experience it. One method involves simple repetition. If you take a familiar word, researchers have used door in experiments, and write it or say it repeatedly for several minutes, the word gradually starts to feel strange. Your semantic and perceptual systems essentially become saturated. The word loses its meaning and starts to seem arbitrary, like marks on paper or sounds in air, rather than a meaningful sign. This phenomenon, called jamais vu, is the opposite of déjà vu. Instead of feeling that something new is familiar, you feel that something familiar has become alien. The ease with which jamais vu can be induced demonstrates how fragile our sense of familiarity actually is. Familiarity isn't an inherent property of objects or words. It's a signal generated by your brain's recognition systems. When those systems are overtaxed through repetition, they stop producing the signal reliably. The word door hasn't changed. Your ability to recognize it as familiar has temporarily broken down, and with that breakdown comes a subtle sense of unreality. If a word you've known your entire life can suddenly feel foreign, what else might your brain be mistakenly presenting as familiar or unfamiliar? This connects to a broader insight about how perception works. Your brain doesn't passively receive sensory information. It's constantly making predictions about what sensory information should arrive next based on context, past experience, and current goals. Perception is the process of comparing incoming sensory data to these predictions. When the data matches predictions, perception flows smoothly and effortlessly. When predictions are violated, the brain updates its model. But this prediction system can malfunction. It can make incorrect predictions, fail to update properly, or lose confidence in its own predictions. When confidence drops, perception becomes tentative and strange. You're still receiving sensory information, but your brain isn't sure what to make of it, and that uncertainty manifests as a feeling that something is off. Derealization can be understood partly as a failure of this predictive system. The brain is still making predictions, still comparing them to incoming data, but something about the process has become unreliable. Maybe predictions are too weak to provide a sense of expectation. Maybe the updating process is sluggish. Maybe the confidence calibration is wrong. So even when predictions match data, the match doesn't register strongly enough to create a sense of familiarity and coherence. The result is perception that feels ungrounded, like you're experiencing the world without the usual scaffolding of expectation and recognition that normally structures experience and makes it feel real. What remains difficult to convey is just how isolating this experience can be. When you try to describe derealization to someone who hasn't felt it, the words seem inadequate. Things don't feel real sounds vague or dramatic. It doesn't capture the specific quality of the experience, the way familiar environments become subtly wrong, the way your own reflection seems like a stranger, the way conversations feel like you're hearing them through a layer of distance. And because the experience is subjective and internal, there's no way to show someone what you mean. You can't point to derealization the way you could point to a broken bone or a rash. It exists entirely within your consciousness, inaccessible to outside verification. This isolation often leads people experiencing chronic derealization to question whether anyone else has ever felt this way, whether what they're experiencing is even real in the sense of being a recognized phenomenon, or whether they're somehow uniquely broken. The validation that comes from learning that derealization is common and well documented can provide some relief, but it doesn't necessarily make the experience less disturbing, because understanding that other people have experienced something similar doesn't change the fact that you're experiencing it now and can't make it stop. Knowledge provides context but not control. The trouble starts when you recognize that nothing you're currently experiencing is actually happening now, not in the way you've always assumed. Visual information takes roughly 60 milliseconds to reach conscious awareness. Auditory information arrives faster, around 15 milliseconds. Touch varies depending on distance from the brain. What you perceive as the unified present moment is actually a patchwork of signals arriving at different times, assembled retroactively into something that feels simultaneous. Your brain doesn't present you with reality as it unfolds. It presents you with a memory of what just happened, edited into coherence. This isn't philosophy, it's measurable delay. The world reaches your senses, gets processed through multiple neural stages, and only then becomes conscious experience. By the time you're aware of seeing something, that something has already occurred. You live perpetually in the recent past, experiencing a timeline your brain has constructed and is now remembering. Most of the time, this doesn't matter. The delays are brief enough that the constructed timeline matches external reality closely enough for functional purposes. You catch the ball. You respond to the question. You navigate the room without collision. But occasionally something disrupts this seamless construction, and suddenly the gap becomes noticeable. The timeline your brain presents starts to feel slightly wrong, as though you're watching events through a pane of glass rather than participating directly in them. This is where derealization sometimes begins. Not from trauma or panic, though those can trigger it, but from a subtle breakdown in the temporal binding that normally makes perception feel immediate and real. Your brain performs an extraordinary feat every moment. It takes sensory information, arriving at different speeds, through different channels, visual, auditory, tactile, proprioceptive, and binds them into a single coherent experience, occurring in what feels like now. This binding isn't automatic. It requires active coordination across multiple brain regions. The thalamus, prefrontal cortex, and parietal areas must synchronize their activity, integrating disparate inputs into unified conscious experience. When this integration works properly, you experience reality as a smooth flow. When it falters, even slightly, perception can feel fragmented or delayed. You might notice that sounds seem disconnected from the visual events that should be causing them, or that your own movements feel slightly delayed, as though you're controlling your body remotely, or that the entire scene before you lacks the quality of presentness, as though you're watching a recording rather than experiencing something happening now. Research into temporal consciousness reveals just how much work goes into creating the illusion of now. Studies using precise timing show that the brain actively manipulates perceived timing to maintain synchrony. When visual and auditory signals arrive at different times, the brain shifts the perceived moment of the visual event to align with the auditory one. It's rewriting the timeline on the fly, adjusting timestamps to create the impression of simultaneity. This is functional under normal circumstances, but it reveals something unsettling about conscious experience. What you perceive as now is already a reconstruction. Your sense of living in the present is itself a kind of memory, a narrative your brain tells about what just happened, presented with enough confidence that you mistake it for direct experience. And when that narrative construction becomes unreliable, when the confidence falters or the timing slips, reality stops feeling real. Consider what happens during intense anxiety. The brain enters a state of hypervigilance, heightened arousal meant to detect threats. This involves increased activity in attention and arousal systems, particularly in the prefrontal cortex and anterior cingulate cortex. These regions, which normally help integrate emotion with cognition, instead begin working overtime, creating excessive cognitive control. This sounds like it should improve perception. More attention, more awareness, better processing, but the effect is paradoxical. The hyperactive control systems actually interfere with normal perceptual integration. They create too much distance between raw sensory input and conscious experience. The brain is trying so hard to monitor and regulate incoming information that the monitoring itself becomes intrusive, creating a barrier between you and what you're perceiving. Neuroimaging studies show this clearly. During episodes of derealization, there's often heightened activity in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and reduced activity in emotion processing regions like the amygdala. The thinking parts of the brain are working harder while the feeling parts grow quieter. What emerges is perception, stripped of its normal emotional coloring, experience that feels intellectually recognized but emotionally distant. You see your surroundings, you understand them, but they feel like they're happening to someone else or like you're observing them from behind a barrier. The cognitive recognition remains intact while the emotional registration drops away, creating that characteristic sense of unreality where everything looks right but feels wrong. This emotional disconnection is central to why derealization feels so disturbing. Normal perception isn't just sensory information processed and understood. It's sensory information that arrives already colored with emotional significance. When you see a familiar face, recognition isn't just identifying features. It's a feeling of familiarity, a sense of emotional resonance that confirms the person is real and meaningful to you. In derealization, this emotional coloring diminishes or vanishes. You still recognize the face, you know who the person is, but the expected feeling of familiarity doesn't arrive. The face looks correct but feels strange, as though you're seeing a highly realistic photograph rather than an actual person. The absence of expected emotional response creates profound cognitive dissonance. You know intellectually that this person is familiar, but you feel nothing, and that absence of feeling makes everything seem unreal. Research describes this as visual hypoemotionality. The visual system continues functioning normally, transmitting accurate information about shapes, colors, distances, but the pathway that normally links visual recognition to emotional response has been disrupted. The corticolimbic system, which integrates cognitive processing with emotional experience, becomes functionally disconnected. Information flows through the visual cortex and reaches conscious awareness, but it never triggers the limbic structures that would normally generate emotional significance. What remains is perception without feeling. Accurate but empty, correct but disconnected. The effect extends beyond vision. Your own body can feel strange. Your movements might seem mechanical, as though you're operating limbs remotely. Your voice sounds foreign. Your thoughts feel like they're happening to someone else. Even your sense of being a continuous self across time can fragment, leaving you uncertain whether the person who existed 5 minutes ago is the same person experiencing this moment now. This isn't psychosis. You don't lose touch with reality in the sense of believing false things or hallucinating. Your reality testing remains intact. You know the world is real. You know you're experiencing it. What's lost is the felt sense of reality, the subjective quality that normally makes experience feel vivid, immediate, and emotionally resonant. Philosophers sometimes distinguish between access consciousness and phenomenal consciousness. Access consciousness is the functional aspect, the information available for reasoning, reporting, and guiding behavior. Phenomenal consciousness is the felt quality of experience, what it's like to perceive something. During derealization, access consciousness largely persists. You can still process information, make decisions, function in the world. What diminishes is phenomenal consciousness, the qualitative richness that makes experience feel real and meaningful. This distinction matters because it reveals what derealization actually disrupts. It's not your ability to perceive, it's the quality of perceiving, the felt texture that normally accompanies awareness. And this suggests that our ordinary sense of reality depends not just on accurate perception, but on a kind of emotional and phenomenal richness that can be stripped away while leaving basic perceptual function intact. The question becomes why this happens. Why would the brain create a mechanism that removes emotional coloring from perception? One explanation involves the original evolutionary context of dissociation. During overwhelming threat, when physical escape is impossible, the brain can initiate a kind of psychological escape by dampening emotional responses and creating distance from immediate experience. Dissociation may reduce the psychological impact of trauma. This makes sense as an emergency mechanism. If you can't flee physically, you flee mentally, creating enough internal distance from the traumatic event that its full emotional impact doesn't register. The problem emerges when this mechanism activates inappropriately, triggering during situations that aren't actually threatening or persisting long after the threat has passed. For people who experience trauma, especially in childhood, the dissociative response can become a learned pattern. The brain, having used dissociation as protection once, begins deploying it more readily. Eventually, it might activate during ordinary stress, or even without obvious trigger, creating chronic feelings of unreality that persist regardless of external circumstances. Studies show this clearly. Around 30% of people with post-traumatic stress disorder report experiencing persistent derealization or depersonalization, compared to only about 2% in the general population. The statistical difference is substantial. Trauma significantly increases the likelihood of chronic dissociative symptoms, suggesting that derealization often represents a protective mechanism that has become maladaptive. But this doesn't explain all cases. Many people experience occasional derealization without trauma history. They describe brief episodes during stress, exhaustion, or even during mundane moments when nothing particularly significant is happening. These episodes suggest that derealization isn't solely a trauma response, but can emerge from other disruptions to the systems that normally maintain perceptual coherence and emotional engagement. Sleep deprivation is one common trigger. When you haven't slept adequately, the prefrontal cortex, which coordinates conscious perception and reality monitoring, begins functioning less effectively. The result can be subtle perceptual distortions, difficulty concentrating, and occasionally a sense that the world has become strange or dreamlike. You're still awake, but your brain is borrowing some of the characteristics of dreaming, where reality testing is diminished and bizarre events feel normal. Chronic stress produces similar effects through different mechanisms. Prolonged activation of stress systems, particularly elevated cortisol, can affect hippocampal function. The hippocampus plays a crucial role in memory formation and spatial navigation, but it also helps construct the narrative coherence of conscious experience. When hippocampal function is compromised, your sense of temporal continuity and spatial stability can become uncertain. The world still looks normal, but something about your relationship to it feels off. Even routine and boredom can trigger mild derealization. When environments become too familiar and predictable, the brain shifts into autopilot, processing information with minimal conscious attention. This is usually efficient. You don't need to consciously attend to every step while walking a familiar route or every word during a routine conversation. But sometimes, this automaticity becomes too complete, creating too much distance between conscious awareness and immediate experience. You arrive at your destination without remembering the journey. You complete tasks without feeling like you were fully present during them. This is related to highway hypnosis, the phenomenon where you drive for extended periods without conscious memory of the drive. Your brain was still processing sensory information, making decisions, controlling the vehicle, but conscious awareness had partially disengaged, leaving you with the unsettling feeling that you somehow weren't fully there during the experience. When this automatic processing becomes pervasive, it shades into derealization. Life starts feeling like it's happening on autopilot, as though you're watching yourself move through familiar routines without fully inhabiting the experience. You're functioning but not quite present, going through motions that feel mechanical rather than engaged. What all these triggers share is disruption to the systems that normally create engaged, emotionally resonant, temporally coherent, conscious experience. Whether through trauma, anxiety, exhaustion, or simple routine, something interferes with the brain's ability to construct perception that feels vivid, immediate, and real. What remains is technically accurate perception that has lost its felt quality, correct information that somehow doesn't feel quite right. And once you notice this, once you become aware that your perception feels strange, the awareness itself can worsen the problem. You start monitoring your own experience, checking whether things feel real, which creates another layer of distance between you and immediate perception. The self-monitoring becomes intrusive, preventing the natural flow of attention that normally makes experience feel effortless and real. This creates a feedback loop. Derealization triggers anxiety about derealization, which increases self-monitoring, which maintains the sense of unreality, which generates more anxiety. Breaking this cycle requires somehow learning to stop checking, to allow perception to occur without constant evaluation. But that's difficult when the feeling of unreality is distressing enough to demand attention. What remains hardest to convey is just how specifically wrong derealization feels compared to ordinary experience. It's not vague dissatisfaction or general unease. It's a precise sense that the relationship between you and the world has changed in a way you can't quite name but can't stop noticing. Things look right but feel wrong, familiar but strange, present but somehow distant. And because this is entirely subjective, entirely internal, there's no way to verify whether what you're experiencing matches what others mean when they describe the same symptoms. You can read that other people have felt reality become unreal, but you can't confirm that their experience resembled yours. The isolation of subjective experience becomes particularly acute when the experience itself involves feeling isolated from reality. This is where explanation reaches its limit. Neuroscience can identify which brain regions show altered activity during derealization. It can measure timing delays and track perceptual integration failures, but it can't quite explain why these measurable changes produce the specific felt quality of unreality. Why does reduced limbic activity feel like perception through glass rather than some other subjective quality? Why does temporal integration failure feel specifically like watching rather than participating? The gap between neural process and subjective quality remains. We can describe what changes in the brain. We can identify triggers and mechanisms. But the actual experience of derealization, what it feels like from inside, stays largely beyond explanation's reach. Yet something remains missing from this account. You can track the neural disconnections, measure the temporal delays, map the chemical imbalances. But the measurements describe what changes, not why those changes produce this particular subjective quality. Why does reduced limbic activity feel like perception through glass rather than simply feeling nothing? Why does temporal integration failure create the sensation of watching rather than some other experience entirely? The explanatory gap here resembles the larger problem of consciousness itself. We can describe the neural correlates of any experience in increasing detail, but the relationship between those correlates and the felt quality of experience remains unclear. The question isn't whether brain states and conscious states are related. Obviously they are. The question is whether describing one fully explains the other. Consider color perception. We understand the physics of wavelengths. We understand the neuroscience of photoreceptors, visual processing pathways, and cortical activation patterns. We can predict which wavelengths will cause someone to report seeing red. But does this explain what red looks like? Does it explain the subjective quality of redness itself? Most neuroscientists would say yes, or at least that there's nothing left to explain once the neural mechanisms are fully described. The subjective quality supervenes on the physical processes. There's no additional mystery beyond understanding how the brain processes wavelength information and generates behavioral responses. But others find this unsatisfying. Understanding how the brain processes wavelength information doesn't seem to explain why that processing feels like anything at all. The relationship between neural activity and subjective experience remains conceptually opaque, even when the causal connections are well understood. Derealization sharpens this tension because it involves a change in the quality of experience without a change in the external stimulus. The same visual input produces different subjective qualities depending on internal neural state. This demonstrates that subjective quality depends on neural processing rather than external reality, but it doesn't resolve whether describing the neural processing fully explains the subjective quality. What makes derealization philosophically interesting is that it's a disruption of normal conscious experience that people can articulate and recognize. Most alterations in neural processing are invisible to consciousness. Your visual cortex performs enormous computational work that never reaches awareness. But derealization creates a change in subjective quality that consciousness detects and finds disturbing. This suggests that consciousness has access to information about its own processing, at least sometimes. You're aware not just of the content of perception, but of how perception feels. And when that feeling changes, consciousness registers the change as significant even when the content remains technically accurate. The question is whether this awareness of perceptual quality is itself just another neural process that could be explained mechanistically, or whether it points to something about consciousness that resists straightforward neural reduction. Most likely the former, but the intuition persists that something about subjective quality eludes explanation even when all the mechanisms are mapped. What remains genuinely difficult is explaining why any neural process feels like anything. Why doesn't visual processing simply occur in the dark, so to speak? Why does it generate this additional quality of seeming to be like something? And why does disrupting certain integration processes change that quality in this specific way rather than some other way or no way at all? These questions may simply reflect confusion about categories. Perhaps asking why neural processes feel like something is like asking why triangles have three sides. It's definitional rather than explanatory. Certain types of integrated information processing just a conscious experience. There's no additional fact about consciousness beyond the processing itself, but the questions persist partly because subjective experience feels so different from third-person description. Even complete neural knowledge doesn't seem to bridge that gap experientially. You could know everything about another person's neural states and still not know what their experience feels like from inside. This asymmetry between first-person and third-person access seems fundamental rather than merely epistemic. Derealization demonstrates this asymmetry clearly. From the outside, someone experiencing derealization may appear entirely normal. Their neural activity shows measurable differences, but their behavior remains functional. They can describe what they're experiencing, but the description never fully conveys the felt quality. The subjective dimension remains private even when all the objective correlates are shared. This privacy isn't mysterious in a supernatural sense. It's simply that subjective experience is inherently perspectival. It exists only from a particular point of view, only for a particular experiencer. No amount of third-person description can reproduce that first-person perspective, because perspective itself is the thing being described. Some argue this means consciousness involves something beyond physical processes, but that doesn't follow. Perspective might be a fundamental feature of certain physical systems without requiring anything non-physical. A system that models itself and monitors its own states from an internal viewpoint is simply a particular kind of physical system, not evidence of non-physical properties. The difficulty is that our intuitions about consciousness were shaped by dualistic thinking. We're used to imagining mind and matter as separate categories. So when we encounter the mind-body relationship, we expect some kind of bridge between categorically different things. But if consciousness is physical from the start, there's no bridge to build. There's just the question of which physical systems are conscious, and why those specific organizational patterns generate experience. Derealization might offer insight here because it involves a change in conscious quality produced by a change in neural organization. The same basic perceptual content, processed slightly differently, feels completely different subjectively. This suggests that subjective quality depends heavily on organizational factors rather than just information content. When visual processing is emotionally colored by limbic input, perception feels vivid and real. When that emotional input is reduced, the same visual information feels flat and unreal. The difference isn't in what you see, but in how the seeing is integrated with other neural processes. Integration pattern determines subjective quality. This points toward theories of consciousness that emphasize integration and information relationships rather than specific neural substrates. Consciousness might depend more on how information is organized and related than on which particular neurons fire. Disrupt the organization, and you disrupt the quality of experience even when the information content remains similar. But this still doesn't fully explain why any particular organizational pattern produces any particular subjective quality. Why does this specific pattern of integration feel like vivid perception, while that slightly different pattern feels like derealized perception? The mapping between organization and quality remains unexplained. Perhaps no further explanation is possible. Perhaps certain organizational patterns just are certain subjective qualities, and asking why they're connected is asking for an impossible type of explanation. We can describe the patterns, we can predict which patterns correspond to which qualities, but we can't explain the correspondence itself because there's nothing deeper to appeal to. Or perhaps we're asking the wrong question. Instead of asking why neural patterns produce subjective qualities, maybe we should recognize that subjective qualities just are what certain neural patterns feel like from inside. There's no production, no causation, no mysterious connection. There's just one process described from two perspectives. This dissolves the explanatory gap by denying there's anything to explain. Neural processing and conscious experience aren't two different things mysteriously connected. They're the same thing described differently. One description uses physical vocabulary, the other uses experiential vocabulary, but both refer to the same underlying process. If this is right, then derealization isn't a mystery about how neural changes produce experiential changes. It's just a case where we notice a change in what certain neural processes feel like from inside. The feeling of unreality is what disrupted integration feels like. There's no further explanation required. Many find this unsatisfying. It seems to trivialize consciousness by reducing it to mere neural activity. But the reduction goes both ways. If conscious experience just is what certain neural activity feels like from inside, then neural activity has this additional intrinsic property of being experienced. Physics describes matter from the outside. Consciousness reveals what certain organized matter is like from inside. This doesn't solve every problem. It doesn't explain which physical systems are conscious or why organization matters. It doesn't predict which organizational changes will feel like what, but it removes the explanatory gap by refusing to treat consciousness and neural activity as separate phenomena requiring connection. Derealization then becomes simply a change in what integrated neural processing feels like when integration is disrupted. The feeling of unreality isn't caused by neural disconnection. It is what neural disconnection feels like when you're the system experiencing it. The strangeness persists because you're experiencing a mode of processing your brain wasn't designed for, one that normally occurs only in dreams or severe stress. What this leaves unexplained is why evolution or development produced systems capable of this kind of self-aware monitoring in the first place. Why should neural processing be accompanied by awareness of its own quality? What adaptive advantage does consciousness of perceptual quality provide? One possibility is that monitoring perceptual quality helps detect when processing is unreliable. If perception feels strange, that might signal that sensory integration is failing, and conclusions drawn from that perception should be weighted less heavily. Derealization would then be an error signal, indicating that current perceptual processing shouldn't be fully trusted. This would explain why derealization feels disturbing. It's meant to feel disturbing. It's a warning that something is wrong with how experience is being constructed. The discomfort motivates you to change something about your situation or mental state to restore normal processing. But this still doesn't explain why the warning takes the form of subjective quality rather than just producing behavioral adjustments without any felt component. Why not simply reduce confidence in perceptual judgments without creating the experience of unreality? The answer might be that conscious experience is how confidence adjustments feel from inside. When the brain reduces trust in perceptual processing, that reduction is experienced as perception feeling strange or unreal. The subjective quality and the computational adjustment are the same event described from different perspectives. This brings us back to the identity theory. Conscious qualities are what certain computational states feel like from inside. There's no additional mystery about how computation produces consciousness, because consciousness just is what computation feels like when you're the system doing it. If you find this unsatisfying, you're not alone. Many philosophers and neuroscientists find identity theory too quick, too dismissive of genuine puzzles about consciousness. But the alternative seems to be accepting that subjective quality involves something beyond physical process, which raises more problems than it solves. What remains true regardless of theoretical position is that derealization reveals something about how fragile and constructed our sense of reality is. The feeling that perception is direct and immediate is itself part of what the brain constructs. When construction falters, the sense of directness disappears, revealing that normal experience involves enormous hidden processing. Most of the time, this processing works seamlessly. Integration happens automatically. Emotional coloring is applied correctly. Temporal binding synchronizes sensory streams, and the result feels simply like direct access to reality. But that feeling of directness is itself something the brain creates. It's not a property of perception itself, but part of what normal processing produces. Derealization strips away that feeling without removing the perceptual content, making visible the difference between perceiving and feeling, like you're perceiving directly. The gap between these is normally invisible. Derealization makes it explicit, uncomfortable, and impossible to ignore. You perceive, but no longer feel that your perception is truly connecting you to what's there. The connection feels severed even though information flow continues. This suggests that the sense of presence, of being genuinely in contact with reality, is a specific feature the brain adds to perception rather than an inherent property of perception itself. When that feature is removed, perception continues, but feels hollow, distant, mediated. What you're experiencing is perception without the normal sense of perceptual presence. That sense of presence may be what philosophers call phenomenal consciousness, the what-it's-likeness of experience. Derealization would then be a state where access consciousness remains intact, but phenomenal consciousness is degraded. You have the information, but not the full subjective quality normally associated with that information. This distinction between access and phenomenal consciousness remains controversial. Some argue they're inseparable aspects of a single phenomenon. Others maintain they can dissociate. Derealization might provide evidence for the latter view, showing that you can have perceptual content without full phenomenal presence. But maybe what's dissociating isn't consciousness itself, but meta-awareness of consciousness. Perhaps in derealization, you remain fully conscious, but lose the normal sense of being conscious. The experience continues, but the self-monitoring system that tracks experiential quality becomes disrupted, creating the feeling that experience itself has changed. This would explain why derealization is so difficult to describe. You're trying to report a change in self-monitoring rather than a change in perception itself. But self-monitoring is inherently harder to articulate because it's a higher order process that normally operates beneath explicit awareness. When it malfunctions, you notice something is wrong without being able to specify exactly what. What becomes clear through all of this is that consciousness involves layers of processing that normally feel unified but can separate. There's the perceptual content, the emotional coloring, the temporal integration, the sense of presence, and the meta-awareness of all of these. Normally they function as one seamless experience. Derealization reveals them as distinct processes that can fail independently, creating the uncanny sense that reality has become unreal. The recognition that consciousness is layered challenges not just neuroscience, but something more fundamental about self-knowledge. You can observe your own perceptions, but you cannot directly observe the mechanisms that generate the sense of observing. This creates an explanatory horizon built into first-person investigation. The tools of introspection are themselves part of what needs explaining. When derealization occurs, you become aware of this limitation viscerally. You notice that something has changed, but cannot specify precisely what. The change exists at a level beneath accessible introspection. You're trying to report on metaprocessing that normally operates silently, and the resulting descriptions feel inadequate because they are. Language evolved to describe objects and events, not the quality of conscious monitoring itself. This points toward a deeper problem. The same system that constructs experience also evaluates whether that experience feels normal. When the evaluation system malfunctions, it creates a report that experience itself has changed. But maybe experience remains constant, while only the monitoring has shifted. There's no independent perspective from which to check. You cannot step outside consciousness to compare how it feels now versus how it felt before, except through memory, which is itself part of the system under examination. Philosophy has struggled with this circularity for centuries. Descartes attempted to find certainty by doubting everything except the fact of doubting itself. But even that foundational certainty assumes the reliability of introspection. If the mechanisms generating the sense of thinking can malfunction, then even "I think therefore I am" becomes less secure. Derealization suggests that the feeling of thinking, of being present to oneself, can dissociate from cognitive content. You continue processing information while losing the sense that you are genuinely there doing so. Some philosophers argue this reveals consciousness as more fragile than Descartes imagined. Others suggest it merely reveals the constructed nature of self-awareness without challenging consciousness itself. The disagreement reflects how little consensus exists about what consciousness fundamentally is. Definitions vary wildly. Some define it as any information processing, others require specific types of integration or self-monitoring. Still others focus on phenomenal qualities that resist functional description entirely. Derealization seems to challenge all these definitions differently. If consciousness is just information processing, why does losing the sense of presence matter at all? Information continues flowing. The system continues responding appropriately to inputs. But subjectively it matters enormously. This suggests consciousness involves something beyond mere processing, something phenomenal that can dissociate from function. Alternatively, maybe derealization shows that phenomenal consciousness and access consciousness are not as distinct as some theories propose. Perhaps what changes is not consciousness itself, but cognitive access to certain aspects of it. The sense of presence might be a specific type of meta-representation that can fail independently. You remain conscious, but lose conscious access to the quality of being conscious. The recursion breaks at a specific level. Neuroscience cannot yet settle this debate because the relevant mechanisms remain partially unknown. We can identify brain regions involved in derealization, measure changes in connectivity, even correlate symptoms with neurotransmitter levels. But we cannot explain why any of this produces subjective unreality rather than something else. The explanatory gap between neural process and phenomenal experience remains. Some neuroscientists dismiss this gap as illusory, arguing that once we fully understand neural mechanisms, subjective qualities will no longer seem mysterious. Others maintain that even complete neural understanding would leave phenomenal experience unexplained. Derealization seems to support the latter view. Even if we perfectly mapped every neural change during an episode, we would still face the question of why those changes feel like unreality rather than something entirely different. This limitation frustrates some researchers and fascinates others. For those focused on mechanism, subjective reports seem frustratingly imprecise. For those focused on consciousness itself, the imprecision reflects something fundamental about first-person perspective that cannot be eliminated. Derealization makes this tension explicit because it involves a change that is entirely subjective, yet clearly real to those experiencing it. The condition also reveals how much of ordinary experience depends on processes that feel effortless precisely because they work well. Emotional coloring seems automatic until it stops. Temporal binding seems natural until it fails. The sense of presence seems fundamental until it vanishes. These processes become visible only through malfunction, like noticing the mechanics of walking only after injury. This suggests that normal experience involves enormous hidden complexity that conscious awareness never accesses directly. Most of what makes perception feel real happens beneath explicit notice. When those processes falter, the result is not simply altered perception, but awareness that perception was always more constructed than it felt. The sense of directness was itself part of what the brain produced. Some find this realization disturbing. It suggests that the reliability of experience cannot be taken for granted. Others find it clarifying, arguing it removes false certainty and replaces it with honest recognition of how perception actually works. Derealization, in this view, is not a departure from normal experience, but a revelation of what normal experience always was. A construction that usually succeeds in feeling direct. This interpretation faces objections. If normal experience is already constructed, why doesn't it always feel unreal? What changes during derealization, if not the fundamental nature of perception? The answer might be that construction normally includes generating the sense of non-construction. Part of what the brain builds is the feeling that nothing is being built. When that meta-level process fails, the construction becomes partially visible while remaining incomplete. This would explain why derealization feels so uncanny. You become aware that experience is constructed without gaining access to the construction process itself. You see the gap without seeing what fills it. The result is not understanding, but confusion. Not insight, but alienation. It's like suddenly noticing that you're dreaming but being unable to wake up or control the dream. Awareness shifts while circumstances remain unchanged. The relationship between insight and distress varies widely among those who experience derealization. Some report that understanding the mechanisms reduces anxiety. Knowing that unreality reflects neural process rather than metaphysical catastrophe helps frame the experience as manageable. Others find that intellectual understanding does little to alleviate subjective distress. The feeling persists regardless of what they know about its origins. This difference suggests that knowledge and experience operate on separate tracks. You can know intellectually that perception is constructed while still feeling that it should not be. The emotional response reflects deeper assumptions about reality that conceptual understanding cannot fully override. Evolution built brains to treat perception as direct and reliable because that approach generally works. When perception fails to feel reliable, emotional systems respond with alarm regardless of what cognitive systems believe. Treatment for derealization typically involves addressing underlying anxiety, trauma, or neurological factors rather than trying to think one's way out of the condition. Cognitive behavioral approaches help by reducing the anxiety that often accompanies and perpetuates symptoms. Medications that affect serotonin or dopamine systems can help restore normal emotional coloring and reduce perceptual fading. Trauma-focused therapy addresses dissociative patterns that may have originated as protective responses. These interventions work not by changing beliefs about consciousness, but by restoring normal function to the system that generate the sense of reality. They treat mechanism rather than metaphysics. This pragmatic approach succeeds clinically while leaving philosophical questions unresolved. The fact that derealization can be treated does not explain what it reveals about consciousness. What remains clear is that reality feeling real is not automatic. It requires continuous successful integration of multiple neural processes, any of which can fail independently. The unified quality of normal experience is an achievement, not a given. When achievement falters, unity fragments into components that were always present but previously invisible. This fragmentation does not prove consciousness is fundamentally divided. It might simply show that unified consciousness depends on subsystems that can malfunction. The unity is real when it works, even if It emerges from parts that can separate. The sense of reality is genuine when properly constructed, even though construction is required. The fact that construction can be disrupted without eliminating consciousness entirely suggests that consciousness may be more fundamental than the specific qualities it takes on. Derealization removes certain phenomenal features while leaving others intact. You remain aware while awareness feels wrong. This dissociation between awareness and its qualities might indicate that consciousness is not reducible to any particular phenomenal content. Alternatively, it might just show that different aspects of phenomenal consciousness depend on different neural substrates. When some substrates malfunction, corresponding phenomenal features disappear, while others remain. This would make consciousness plural rather than singular, a collection of capacities rather than a unified phenomenon. Derealization would then reveal not the fundamental nature of consciousness, but its compositional structure. The inability to choose definitively between these interpretations reflects how much remains unknown. Derealization raises questions that current science cannot answer. This does not mean the questions are meaningless or that answers are impossible. It means we are still early in the investigation. The phenomenon itself is clear. The explanation is not. What derealization ultimately demonstrates is that the sense of reality is contingent on mechanisms we do not control and barely understand. Normal experience feels solid, but that solidity is constructed moment by moment through processes that can fail. When they do, reality becomes strange without ceasing to be experienced. The strangeness reveals what was always true, but usually invisible, that consciousness is not a passive window, but an active construction, one that includes building the sense that nothing is being built. Understanding none of this eliminates the experience. You can map every neural pathway involved in derealization, trace every neurotransmitter imbalance, identify every disrupted integration process. The explanations remain correct. The mechanisms are real. But standing in a familiar hallway that suddenly feels like a stage set, none of that knowledge changes what the moment feels like. This is perhaps the most unsettling aspect. Scientific understanding provides context but not control. You learn that reduced limbic connectivity strips emotional colouring from perception, that temporal binding failures create the sense of watching rather than participating, that protective dissociation can activate inappropriately. All true, all verifiable through imaging studies and clinical observation, and still the feeling persists that something fundamental about your relationship to reality has shifted in a way that explanation cannot quite touch. The gap between mechanism and experience remains, not because neuroscience is incomplete, though it is, not because consciousness hides something non-physical, though some believe it does. The gap persists because explaining how something works does not always explain what it feels like to be the thing working. You are the integration process that has temporarily lost coherence. Understanding the process from outside does not restore coherence from inside. This reveals something about the limits of self-knowledge that extends beyond derealization. Consciousness has access to its own contents, but not to the mechanisms generating those contents. You can observe that perception feels strange, but cannot directly observe why. The machinery operates beneath the level where introspection reaches. What remains accessible is only the output. The feeling of unreality, the sense that something has changed, the awareness that normal experience has become unavailable. Some find this limitation intellectually frustrating. Others find it philosophically significant. It suggests that first-person investigation of consciousness faces inherent boundaries. The tools of introspection are themselves part of what needs explaining. You cannot step outside consciousness to examine it. You are always already inside, trying to understand the water while swimming. Derealization makes this limitation acute because it involves a change you notice but cannot fully characterize. Something about the quality of experience has shifted, but quality itself resists precise description. You reach for metaphors, glass barriers, sensory fog, dreamlike distance, knowing they approximate without capturing. Language evolved to describe objects and events, not the texture of conscious monitoring itself. What this leaves is a kind of epistemic loneliness. The experience is entirely yours, inaccessible to outside verification, difficult to convey even to others who have felt something similar. You cannot confirm that their derealization resembles yours. Subjective quality remains private even when neural correlates are shared. This privacy is not mysterious in a supernatural sense. It simply reflects that experience is inherently perspectival, existing only for a particular experiencer. The recognition that perception is constructed does not make it less real, but it does make it less certain. You discover that the stability you assumed was an achievement requiring continuous, successful integration of processes that can fail independently. The unified quality of normal experience is genuine when it works, even if it emerges from components that can separate. When those components separate, what remains is awareness of the separation without access to the joining mechanism. You know something is wrong without being able to specify exactly what. The monitoring system that tracks experiential quality reports malfunction while remaining unable to repair it. This creates the peculiar situation of being unable to trust your own perception while having no alternative access to reality. All you have is perception. When it becomes unreliable, you are left without stable ground. Philosophy and neuroscience approach this differently, but reach similar limits. Philosophy identifies the explanatory gap between neural process and subjective quality, then divides over whether the gap is real or illusory. Neuroscience maps mechanisms with increasing precision, then faces the question of whether complete mechanistic understanding would explain subjective experience or simply correlates with it. Derealization does not resolve these debates, it simply makes them less abstract. When your own perception loses its sense of reality, philosophical questions about consciousness stop being purely theoretical. They become immediate, personal, and impossible to ignore. The relationship between neural activity and subjective quality matters when the quality has become disturbing and the activity measurably different. What treatment reveals is that derealization can often be addressed through interventions targeting underlying mechanisms. Reducing anxiety restores normal integration. Trauma therapy resolves maladaptive dissociation patterns. Medication can help restore emotional coloring and perceptual vividness. These approaches work by fixing what is broken, rather than by changing beliefs about consciousness. This pragmatic success leaves philosophical questions unresolved. The fact that derealization responds to treatment does not explain why disrupted integration feels like unreality rather than something else. It confirms that subjective quality depends on neural organization without explaining the dependence itself. The mapping between mechanism and experience remains unexplained even when manipulation of mechanism reliably changes experience. Perhaps this is as far as explanation can go. We can describe which organizational patterns correspond to which experiential qualities. We can predict that disrupting integration will produce feelings of unreality. We can even intervene to restore normal patterns. But the correspondence itself, why this neural pattern produces this subjective quality, may not admit a further explanation. It may simply be what the pattern is, described from inside. This does not mean consciousness is beyond science. It means subjective quality may be a fundamental aspect of certain physical systems rather than something derived from more basic properties. Physics describes matter from outside. Consciousness reveals what certain organized matter is like from inside. Both descriptions are complete within their domains. Neither reduces to the other. If this is correct, then derealization is not a mystery about how neural changes produce experiential changes. It is a case where we notice what disrupted integration feels like when you are the system experiencing it. The feeling of unreality is what happens when the processes that normally generate the sense of reality malfunction. There is no deeper explanation because there is nothing more fundamental to appeal to. Some find this account satisfying, others find it evasive. The disagreement likely reflects different intuitions about what counts as explanation. Those satisfied believe that mapping structure to experience exhausts what can be known. Those unsatisfied believe something about subjective quality escape structural description. What remains undeniable is the experience itself. However we explain or fail to explain it, derealization occurs. People feel that reality has become unreal, despite knowing intellectually that nothing external has changed. The feeling is real, even when its object is not. This creates a strange situation where subjective report is both accurate and inaccurate simultaneously. The person is right that their experience has changed. They are wrong that reality has changed. But experience is their only access to reality. So in a sense, both are true. This paradox is not unique to derealization. It characterizes conscious experience generally. We assume perception provides direct access to external reality, while knowing that perception is constructed through complex neural processing. We feel that our experiences are immediate, while understanding that they emerge from mechanisms operating beneath awareness. We trust our senses while recognizing they can be fooled. Derealization simply makes this tension explicit. The construction that usually feels transparent becomes partially visible without becoming fully accessible. You are aware that perception is assembled but cannot observe the assembly. You notice that reality is constructed but cannot reach the construction process. What remains is uncomfortable awareness that the stability of experience depends on processes you neither control nor fully understand. For most, this awareness eventually fades as neural function normalizes. The sense of reality returns. Perception feels immediate again. The processes that generate the feeling of directness resume working smoothly enough that their operation becomes invisible once more. Life continues with renewed appreciation for what previously went unnoticed. That feeling real requires enormous hidden work. For some, the awareness persists. They have seen that consciousness is more fragile than they assumed. The sense that perception is reliable has been permanently complicated. They know intellectually that normal function has returned, but something about the certainty is gone. They have discovered that the ground beneath experience is less solid than it seemed. It holds most of the time, but it held before too, until it didn't. This is perhaps what derealization ultimately teaches, that conscious experience is not a given, but an achievement, maintained through continuous successful operation of processes that can fail. The feeling of being present, of reality being real, of perception connecting you to the world. These are not inherent features of awareness, but specific qualities that depend on particular patterns of neural integration. When integration succeeds, experience feels direct and certain. When it fails, the constructed nature becomes briefly visible before usually restoring itself. The restoration does not erase the recognition. You have seen that consciousness involves mechanisms operating beneath awareness, generating qualities that feel fundamental but depend on processes that can break. The sense of reality is genuine when it works, but it is also contingent, vulnerable, and more complex than it feels from inside. What you're left with is not quite the naive certainty you had before, but perhaps that is closer to honest recognition of what consciousness actually is. Not a transparent window onto reality, but an ongoing construction that usually succeeds in feeling transparent. When construction fails, transparency disappears, revealing that the window was always built from mechanisms you cannot directly access. The mechanisms remain largely hidden. The construction continues, but now you know it is construction, even when it works well enough that you forget. This knowledge does not prevent future episodes. It does not fully protect against anxiety about derealization, but it provides something: the recognition that feeling unreal is not evidence that you're losing contact with reality, but that the systems maintaining the sense of contact have temporarily shifted into a different processing mode. The shift is disturbing. The disturbance is understandable, and both are features of how consciousness actually works when observed from inside its own operation. The hallway looks the same as it did before. Light still falls through the window. Your footsteps still sound against the floor, but something about your relationship to these facts has changed slightly. Not permanently, probably. Not drastically, hopefully, but enough that you notice the difference between perception and the sense of perceiving, between reality and the feeling of reality, between consciousness and the quality consciousness takes when integration works as it should. That difference remains, quiet and mostly unnoticed, until the next time something shifts and the gap becomes visible again. For now, it is invisible. The processes have resumed their hidden work. Experience feels direct once more. But beneath that directness, the same mechanisms continue operating, maintaining the sense of presence that makes reality feel real. They have always been there. They remain there now, and they will continue their work, mostly successfully, mostly invisibly, until they don't.